You gave up your first-class seat for a stranger, are you crazy? That's what they told her, but Sarah Miller didn't listen. She saw the wounded veteran sitting alone, she saw the scars everyone else tried to ignore, and without hesitation, she gave up the one luxury she might never have again. She thought it was just a simple act of kindness. She didn't know that months later, an army convoy would rumble up her dirt road, that strangers in uniform would rebuild her broken farm, that the man she helped was a hero who had once saved dozens. Stay with us to see how. One decision changed everything. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of her family's small farm in rural Georgia, the early morning mist curling around the weathered fence posts like sleepy ghosts. Beyond the fields, the two-lane highway stretched out of sight, a silver ribbon winding toward places she had only ever imagined. Her rubber boots sank slightly into the damp earth as she leaned against the old wooden gate, a steaming mug of coffee cradled between her hands. 29 years old, and she'd never set foot beyond the surrounding counties. Her world was the farm, a crumbling relic left behind by her late parents, the small Saturday farmers market where she sold hand-picked vegetables and homemade jam. It wasn't that she hated it, there was a kind of quiet dignity in coaxing life from stubborn soil, in knowing every sunrise and every rut in the dirt road like old friends. But sometimes when the stars scattered wide across the sky, Sarah would lie awake and ache for something, anything more. She dreamed of places where the streets never ended, oceans she couldn't see across, mountains so high they stole your breath. Travel was a distant fantasy though. The farm barely broke even. She patched up the roof herself, fixed the tractor with borrowed parts, and bought groceries with whatever was left after the feed and seed were paid for. Airplane tickets, hotels, vacations, they belonged to another world entirely, at least until the unexpected invitation arrived. It came in the form of a thick cream-colored envelope addressed to her in a familiar looping script. Sarah tore it open with calloused fingers and pulled out a wedding invitation from Amanda Clark, her college roommate and one of the few friends who had kept in touch after Sarah returned home to run the farm. Amanda was getting married in Seattle. Inside the envelope was another surprise, a printed confirmation for a plane ticket purchased with Amanda's frequent flyer miles. I won't take no for an answer, Amanda had scrawled at the bottom. You're coming, Sarah, you deserve a little adventure. Sarah stared at the ticket for a long moment, the enormity of it sinking in. She would have to find someone to watch the farm, scrape together money for a decent outfit, figure out how airports even work. But beneath all the nervous fluttering in her chest, a spark of excitement took root. Maybe it was time. What would this trip bring? 2 weeks later, Sarah stood at the tiny regional airport, clutching her boarding pass like a lifeline. She wore her best jeans, a clean flannel shirt, and her worn leather boots polished until they shone. Everything about the place felt foreign. The crowds, the mechanical voice crackling over the loudspeakers, the blinking boards full of codes and times. When she found her gate, she settled into a plastic chair by the window and watched the planes taxiing across the runway. She smiled to herself, feeling both utterly out of place and oddly alive. Excuse me, miss, is this seat taken? Sarah turned and looked up into the lined face of an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane. His right leg was stiff, barely bending as he eased himself down, his hands gripping the cane bore deep scars as if from burns long ago. A battered army cap was pulled low over his brow, its faded fabric embroidered with the emblem of a unit Sarah didn't recognize. No, not at all, she said, moving her bag aside. He nodded in thanks, but said nothing more. As he settled into his seat, Sarah noticed how people around them shifted subtly away, giving him a wide berth. Some stole quick glances at his injuries, others avoided looking at him entirely. Sarah knew that kind of silence. She had seen it often enough in her father's final years when cancer had ravaged his body and left him frail and sunken. It was the silence of people who didn't know what to say, and so said nothing at all. She offered a small smile, and after a long moment the man returned it, the corners of his mouth tugging upward beneath the shadow of his cap. The boarding call came over the loudspeaker. Flight Woven 23 to Seattle now boarding. As Sarah rose, smoothing her jeans, the ticket in her pocket said, Group 3, but as she moved toward the gate, an airline staffer flagged her down. Miss Miller, congratulations, you've been selected for a complimentary upgrade, first class today. Sarah blinked, stunned. Are you sure? The woman smiled, positive. Enjoy your flight. She stepped into the line for first class boarding, feeling the stares from passengers still clutching their Group 4 and 5 tickets. It felt surreal, like she was slipping into someone else's life, if only for a few hours. As she handed over her ticket, Sarah glanced back at the man with the cane who was struggling to hoist his battered duffel bag onto his good shoulder. He was heading for the back of the plane, coach middle seat, most likely 14 hours to Seattle. The gate agent smiled. Enjoy your flight, Miss Miller. Sarah hesitated, then, before she could talk herself out of it, she turned back. Excuse me, she called softly, weaving her way back through the line toward the man. Sir, would you like to trade seats with me? The man looked up, startled. I couldn't please, Sarah insisted, holding out her boarding pass. You deserve a little comfort. The surrounding crowd shifted some, watching openly now. The veteran stared at her for a long beat. Something flickered in his eyes, a flash of understanding. Pride wrestled down by exhaustion. He took the ticket with a trembling hand. Thank you, he said, voice rough with something more than age. Sarah just smiled. Have a good flight, sir. As he shuffled toward the first-class cabin, Sarah retrieved his old economy seat, her heart strangely lighter than it had been in years. Little did she know, this act would echo far beyond the flight. Sarah squeezed into her narrow economy seat, tucking her canvas tote bag under the seat in front of her as the plane filled. The air grew thick with the smells of engine oil, recycled air, and too many people packed into too small a space. She shifted uncomfortably, already regretting her decision to give up the first-class upgrade. But when she glanced forward past the rows of worn fabric seats and fidgeting passengers, she caught a glimpse of the veteran settling into a wide leather chair at the front of the plane. A flight attendant leaned down to speak with him, offering a genuine smile that for once seemed free of pity. Jim Carter, if that was his name, looked awkward, but deeply grateful, his scarred hands clutching the armrests like he couldn't quite believe he belonged there. Sarah smiled faintly and leaned back in her seat, content. Maybe not all good deeds went unnoticed after all. The flight dragged on. 14 hours was a long time under the best conditions, and economy seating was far from the best. The man next to Sarah dozed off with his mouth open, snoring loudly. The child across the aisle dropped a tablet on the floor every few minutes, each crash making Sarah jump. The food was forgettable, the coffee bitter, and every trip to the cramped bathroom felt like a minor expedition. Yet through it all, Sarah found herself strangely buoyant. She thought about the quiet man in first class, thought about the weight he must carry, literal and invisible, and how such a small act had carved a bright human moment out of an otherwise ordinary day. Toward the middle of the flight, Sarah stretched her legs by walking toward the back of the plane. As she passed the first-class curtain, she saw him again. He wasn't sleeping like most of the other passengers. Instead, he stared thoughtfully out the window, his posture a little less guarded, his shoulders more relaxed. Their eyes met for the briefest second. He gave her a nod, not one of thanks this time, but something deeper, recognition. Respect. Sarah nodded back and moved along. When the plane touched down in Seattle, it was late evening. The airport buzzed with exhaustion and relief as passengers pushed past each other to reach baggage claim. Sarah never saw the veteran again. In the blur of arriving relatives, luggage carousels, and the unfamiliar sprawl of a massive airport, he simply disappeared. She thought fleetingly that she should have asked his name, should have done more, but some moments she realized weren't meant to be stretched or dissected. Some were perfect precisely because they ended before they became complicated. Amanda's wedding was everything Sarah had hoped for, and nothing she could have expected. Set in a cozy vineyard tucked in the hills outside the city, the ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Sarah laughed and danced, clinking glasses with strangers who welcomed her like family. For once, she allowed herself to be fully present, to breathe in the scent of fresh-cut flowers, to feel the cool evening breeze tugging at her borrowed dress, to taste the sweetness of a life lived beyond the farm's edges. When she boarded her flight back home a week later, economy class and stiff-legged again, Sarah didn't mind at all. The trip had been more than worth it. Life slipped back into its familiar rhythm: morning chores, farmers' market stalls, endless lists of things to fix or patch or mend. The memory of the flight, the burned veteran, and the seat she'd given up became one more bright thread woven into the quiet fabric of her days. She didn't expect anything more from it. She had already received her reward, the simple joy of doing the right thing without expecting applause, which was why when she woke one blustery Saturday morning to the sound of engines rumbling down her dirt road, Sarah thought at first it must be the neighbor's teenage boys joyriding. She tossed on a jacket and headed for the porch, grumbling good-naturedly about kids and their trucks. But when she stepped outside, her breath caught. It wasn't pickup trucks, it was a convoy. 3 olive green Humvees rumbled to a halt at the end of her drive. Men in crisp army uniforms spilled out, their boots crunching against the gravel. A black SUV with government plates idled behind them, dust swirling around its tires. And at the head of it all, stepping carefully out of the front Humvee, was the man she thought she'd never see again, Jim Carter. Only now he wasn't the anonymous battered passenger she'd offered a seat to. Now he stood tall and straight in a full dress uniform, gleaming medals pinned to his chest, a slight limp still betraying the injuries he'd carried home from distant battlefields. He smiled when he saw her, a slow, genuine smile that melted years from his scarred face. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she stumbled down the porch steps, confusion and awe battling for space in her chest. She had no words, but somehow she knew everything was about to change again. Sarah barely managed to step off the last porch stair before Jim Carter was standing in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine stitching of his uniform, the battered but polished boots, the gleam of metals that caught the gray morning light. "Miss Miller," he said, voice steady but warm, "it's good to see you again." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She simply stared stunned by the sight of armored vehicles lining her dirt driveway and soldiers standing at attention like some surreal honor guard. Jim's smile deepened as if he understood. "You look just as surprised as I was," he added, a quiet chuckle hidden in his voice. Finally, Sarah found her footing and she started, then shook her head, a helpless laugh bubbling up. "I don't understand, what's going on?" Jim stepped back and gestured toward the SUV. A man in a dark suit, earpiece visible under close-cropped hair, approached with the crispness of military precision. He handed Sarah a thick envelope and offered a respectful nod before retreating. Sarah turned the envelope over in her hands. Her name was handwritten across the front in careful script, Miss Sarah Miller. Inside was a single sheet of paper, heavy and official-looking, bearing the gold crest of the United States Army at the top. Certificate of recognition for an act of extraordinary kindness and humanity toward a veteran of the United States Armed Forces. The Department of the Army extends its deepest gratitude to Miss Sarah Miller. Her actions embody the spirit of compassion, respect, and dignity that every soldier fights to protect. Presented by Colonel James Carter III, Special Forces Group Airborne. Sarah blinked, reading the words once, then twice. Colonel. He wasn't just any veteran, he wasn't just a man she had helped on a plane. Jim Carter, Colonel Carter, had been part of one of the Army's most elite units. She looked up, speechless, meeting his gaze. He lifted a hand almost sheepishly. "You didn't know who I was," he said, "and that's exactly why it meant so much." Behind him, a few of the soldiers were unloading something large from the back of one of the Humvees. Sarah could hear the clink of metal and the dull thud of heavy wood hitting the ground. What are they doing?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jim's smile was almost mischievous now. "We brought you something, a few things." Actually, Sarah watched, hammering as two soldiers carefully carried a large wooden crate toward her porch. Another group was setting up what looked suspiciously like construction materials, planks of wood, fencing, wire, heavy tools. "What is this?" she asked again, more firmly, this time. Jim turned fully toward her, his posture straight, almost ceremonial. "You gave me comfort and dignity when you had no reason to," he said simply. "You gave up something precious, a seat that could have made your journey easier just to make mine bearable." Sarah shook her head. "It was just a seat." "It wasn't," Jim said, voice gentle but insistent. "Not to me." He stepped closer again, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I was coming back from a treatment program in Seattle, burn recovery, surgery after surgery. Most days I felt like I wasn't even human anymore, just a set of scars that people wanted to forget." Sarah swallowed hard. The day on the plane, it was the first time in months that someone saw me, not the injuries, not the uniform, just me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cold air bit at Sarah's cheeks. A crow called in the distance. Finally, Jim continued, his tone shifting to something brighter. "So, we thought it was only fair to repay a little of that kindness." He pointed to the crates and the materials. "We're going to rebuild your barn." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Jim nodded. "One of the guys in my unit runs a construction company now. When I told the team what you did, they volunteered, took leave, flew in on their own time. They wanted to do this, not just for me, for you." Sarah looked at the barn, her father's old pride, now half collapsed after a storm last spring. She had tried patch by patch to keep it standing, but it was beyond her skills and beyond her budget. "You don't have to," she began, her voice cracking. Jim's expression softened. "We want to." The day turned into a blur of motion. Soldiers worked with the efficiency and camaraderie that came from years of relying on each other. Sarah barely had time to process it all, watching as they measured, cut, hammered, and repaired. Some set up fresh fencing around her livestock pen, others replaced sagging beams and reinforced the walls. They laughed and traded jokes as they worked, filling the farm with a lively energy Sarah hadn't felt since before her parents passed. At one point, as she carried out lemonade for the crew, she found herself standing beside Jim, watching his men work. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. He looked at her, a glint of humor in his eyes. "You didn't have to give up your seat." Sarah smiled, her throat tight with emotion. "Fair enough," she said. They stood there for a long moment, two people who had crossed each other's paths by pure chance, and whose lives had been quietly, irrevocably changed because of it. As the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the fields, Jim turned to her one last time. "There's one more thing," he said. Reaching into his uniform jacket, he pulled out a small weathered coin. "This is a challenge coin," he explained, pressing it into her hand. "It's something we pass between soldiers to recognize acts of valor, loyalty, or brotherhood." Sarah turned the coin over. On one side was the emblem of the 3rd Special Forces Group, on the other, a simple phrase, "Deeds, not words." "It's not given lightly," Jim said, "and it's rarely given to civilians." Sarah blinked rapidly against the sting in her eyes. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Jim smiled. "You already said it," he replied, "when you saw me." And just like that, Sarah realized kindness wasn't a small thing, it was everything. It built bridges without asking for tolls, it planted seeds in hearts, even ones that had nearly forgotten how to grow, and sometimes, just sometimes, it brought a convoy to your door. The barn stood tall and strong under the afternoon sun, its new red paint, still fresh, gleaming against the backdrop of endless green fields. Sarah leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching the last few nails hammered into place. It looked like it belonged to a postcard now, not the crumbling relic she had almost given up on saving. In the space of a single day, everything had changed, not just the barn, not just the farm, but something inside Sarah, too. As the soldiers packed up their tools and loaded the empty crates back into the Humvees, Jim Carter approached her one final time. "We'll be heading out soon," he said, his voice touched with something Sarah couldn't quite place, something like regret, but gentler. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The thought of the convoy leaving, of the quiet settling back into the farm once more, left a hollow ache in her chest. Jim seemed to sense it. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling a manila folder from the inside of his uniform jacket. Sarah raised an eyebrow as she took it. Inside was a neatly typed letter on official Department of Veterans Affairs letterhead and a check. Her breath caught when she saw the amount. "Jim, what is this?" she whispered, stunned. "The guys pitched in," he said almost sheepishly. "Some of it's from the Veterans Support Fund, some of it's from us personally. We wanted to make sure the farm stays yours for good." Sarah's knees nearly gave out. The money was enough to cover the back taxes she'd been quietly dreading for months, and then some, enough to repair the house, replace the tractor, maybe even hire help for the harvest season. It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity, it was gratitude, pure and simple. She pressed the folder to her chest, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." Jim gave her that small, quiet smile again. "Then don't say anything," he said. "Just promise me you'll keep growing things here." Sarah laughed through the tears gathering in her eyes. "That, Colonel Carter, I can promise." The convoy pulled away just before sunset, the rumble of engines fading into the soft chorus of cicadas. Sarah stood at the edge of the driveway, the check still clutched in her hand, waving until the last Humvee disappeared beyond the trees. For a long time, she simply stood there, feeling the cool breeze brush against her face, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She wasn't sure she had fully processed any of it. All she knew was that her world was bigger now and brighter. The next morning, Sarah rose with the sun as usual. Old habits died hard. She fed the chickens, tended the garden, hauled water to the horses, but everything felt different, somehow lighter, freer. When she walked into town that afternoon to drop off fresh produce at the market, the change rippled ahead of her like a warm wind. People stopped her on the street. They had seen the convoy, they had heard whispers, some had even caught glimpses of the army trucks parked along her dirt road. Landry, the gruff owner of the hardware store, tipped his cap with unusual softness. Mrs. Greaves, the stern librarian, pressed a basket of homemade muffins into Sarah's hands without a word. Even old Mr. Holloway, who hadn't spoken to anyone in a decade, grunted, a quiet good girl, as she passed. Sarah didn't tell them the full story, not because she was hiding it, but because sometimes the best parts of a miracle were the pieces you kept tucked safe inside your own heart. A week later, Sarah received another letter in the mail. This time it was from Jim himself. It wasn't formal or official, it was written in simple blocky handwriting on a plain sheet of notebook paper. "Dear Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about that day on the plane, about how much one small act of kindness can change a life. When I got hurt overseas, I thought I had lost everything that made me who I was, not just my looks, my sense of purpose, my belief in people. You gave it back to me without even knowing it. I wanted you to no, you didn't just give up a seat, you gave a soldier a reason to keep believing, and sometimes that's the kind of rescue that matters most. Stay stubborn, stay kind, keep growing things. If you're ever near Fort Bragg, there's a place at my table. Always, respectfully, Jim Carter." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small wooden box she kept by her bedside, where she stored things too precious to lose. That night, as she lay in bed, the windows open to the cool Georgia breeze, Sarah looked out at the stars and smiled. Somewhere out there, a man she barely knew and yet somehow knew deeply was carrying her kindness forward, and she would keep planting seeds in the earth, in the hearts of strangers, and in the quiet, stubborn hope that a single act of compassion could still, even now, move the world. The seasons turned as they always did. Summer softened into autumn, and Sarah's fields ripened under the golden sun. Rows of pumpkins swelled bright and heavy on the vines, apples blushed deep red on the trees her father had planted years before. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of woods and wet earth. It should have felt like any other harvest season, but it wasn't. Sarah Miller's farm was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. The new barn, a gift born of kindness, stood proudly in the heart of the property, its broad doors open to reveal gleaming tools, stacked hay bales, and healthy livestock. For the first time in years, the roof didn't leak, the fences stood firm, the fields stretched lush and orderly under her careful hand. Neighbors who once passed by with little more than polite nods now slowed their trucks to wave or pulled into the drive with offerings of spare seed, old equipment, or simply warm words. Something had shifted, not just on the land, but in the community. Sarah wasn't just the quiet farm girl anymore, she had become something else, a symbol, maybe a reminder that kindness, when sown well, bore fruit long after the planting. She started small, at the Saturday market. She set out a wooden box beside her produce stand with a handwritten sign, "Take what you need, pay what you can." At first, she worried she would be taken advantage of, but something remarkable happened. People began leaving more than money. One morning, she found a sack of fresh baked bread tucked beside the egg cartons. Another day, a handwritten note that read simply, "You helped my brother when he came home from the war, thank you." And every Saturday, without fail, an anonymous envelope containing exactly $20 appeared under her basket of apples. No name, no note, just steady, quiet support. Sarah never tried to find out who left it. Some things she realized were better left as mysteries wrapped in grace. As the first hard frost crept across the fields one night in November, Sarah stood in the middle of her farm, her boots crunching the brittle grass. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cold air, letting it fill her chest, steady and sure. It wasn't about the barn or the repaired fences or even the check that had saved the farm. It was about something deeper, something planted that no winter could freeze. Hope. That Christmas, Sarah mailed out her first holiday cards, simple ones with hand-drawn sketches of her farm and the snow. She sent one to Amanda, thanking her again for the plane ticket that had started it all. She sent one to the Veterans Support Fund anonymously, and she sent one to Jim Carter. Inside his card, she wrote, "Dear Jim, the farm is still standing, so am I. The seeds you helped me plant, kindness, faith, stubbornness, they're growing strong here. You once told me that sometimes the right rescue doesn't happen on the battlefield. You were right, sometimes it happens in the quietest ways." In a smile, a seat offered without hesitation, a barn rebuilt by strangers who become family. "I hope wherever you are, you're still growing things, too. Merry Christmas, Colonel." Always, Sarah. She dropped the envelope into the mailbox on the edge of her property, smiling up at the endless winter sky as the wind carried her breath away like smoke. She didn't need a reply. Some conversations she knew echoed beyond words. Spring would come again, the fields would green, the farm would hum with new life, and Sarah Miller would keep planting on her land, in her heart, and in the hearts of everyone who crossed her path, because kindness once sown never stopped growing. Not really, it just waited, patient and sure, for the right season to bloom. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.